Okay, so I hope you had a good lunch, and we continue with Spring Boot and the different layers that we've seen in the different classes in the different layers. But before lunch, I saw there were 3 more questions in the chat. First one, what exactly does AutoWire do? I will explain it, I give a demo. Second one, if we annotate domain class as entity, doesn't it make it a Spring Bean? No. Spring doesn't look at entity. That's a JPR annotation, so no. And then there was, I saw on page 63, there's a typo. So it was this constructor injection. And actually, this should be customer service import. Then it's a constructor. So this is the way it should have been. Yeah, good observation. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make a Spring application. And there are different ways to do that, and this is described in the lab, but start.spring.io, it's called Spring Initializer. There you can make a skeleton Spring Boot application. So if I go to that site already, it says already by default Maven, it's a Java project, Spring version 2.5.2, and then I can type some names. The package is a jar file. I want a jar file. I want Java 11. So what I do here is I call it, let's call it demo. The artifact is called demo app. Description demo for Spring Boot. Package is demo. So the application will call demo app. The package will be demo. And I add a dependency here. I want it to be a web application. So here I see Spring Web. So there are a lot of dependencies here that I can choose, but I choose Spring Web. And it says here Spring Web. And I say generate. So now what it does is creating a demo app.zip. Creates a zip file for me. So now I have to unzip it somewhere. So let me put it in the correct place. So you don't see now what I'm doing, but I'm unzipping it in a place that I know. So I unzipped it. Then I'm going to open it. So I always use IntelliJ. That's basically the best IDE there is for Java. You can use Spring. That's okay. It creates a Maven project. You can import a Maven project in Eclipse. You can also do it in IntelliJ. So for all the demos, I will use IntelliJ. And here is where I unzipped it, demo app. This is what I unzipped. So I open it. It will read it, it will read the POM file, and will maybe download some libraries that it needs. So still looking at the dependencies. And here's my demo app. So what did it create? It created for me this Java class. So every Spring Boot application has an application class with a main in it, which is annotated with @Spring Boot application. So it created this already for me. And what do we do in main? Spring application.run. What is Spring application? Well, that's the class already in Spring Boot. So Spring application.run, basically what it does, without going on all the details, it basically scans my class path if there are classes which are annotated with either @service, @component, @controller, or @repository, and it will instantiate these classes. And this is my own class. I call it demo app application. That's this class. So I can talk all day of what happens here. That's not the goal here. I can run it with this. This application doesn't do anything. There's no system out print line or nothing. So what I'm going to do is I create a new class. And I call it the demo controller. And I annotate this class with @REST controller from Spring. And just to show how it works, I will put a constructor in here with a system out print line. In constructor. So I created only one class with a constructor with the annotation @REST controller. And now I run my application. We will see that Spring will instantiate the demo controller. It will run that constructor. And then after this it's over because there's nothing else that happens yet. So it's building. It also does something else, but I will show what it is. Takes a lot of time to build. I have a lot of IntelliJs open, maybe it takes a lot of memory. Shouldn't take that long. Okay, so getting there, you see under still busy. Now it starts running. Now in the Spring Boot application, you always get this kind of banner here with Spring Boot. Actually, okay, it's still busy. Now interesting, what you see now is here, it says Tomcat initialized with port 8080. What does Spring do? When I created this application, I said I need a web dependency. That's this POM file. It puts in the POM file here this web dependency. Whenever I have an application where I have this web dependency, Spring will automatically start this application in Spring, in Tomcat. This is a web container, because I have a web dependency. So normally, if you create a web application, normally what you do is you write the code, but then you have to package it together as a WAR file, a web archive. And then you start somewhere a container, let's say Tomcat. Tomcat is a web container. You start Tomcat. And you deploy this WAR file somewhere on the file system so that Tomcat can see it. You deploy it in Tomcat. So Tomcat runs on a certain port and you deploy your application in Tomcat. What Spring Boot does is just the other way around. What Spring Boot does is it doesn't create a WAR file, it creates a jar file. Actually, it's a jar. So what's the difference? A WAR file is a web archive that you have to deploy in a container. A jar file is a Java archive that only needs a virtual machine to run. It needs a class with a main, and the virtual machine will call it. But in the jar file, Spring Boot puts Tomcat in the jar file. And when I say run, it starts up Tomcat and does everything that it needs to do. Why does it do that? Well, if you have a WAR file and you want to run it on your own developer machine, you have to deploy it in your local web container. Then you want to run it on a test, in a test environment. So you deploy that same WAR file in a test environment. And then maybe you go to the production, or then you want to run it in the cloud. So you have to deploy it all the time and make sure you have a web container, and then in your developer machine it works, but in a test environment it doesn't work because there's a different Tomcat version or a different web container. Now, with Spring Boot we don't need that all. We just have an embedded Tomcat in our application. If we run it, so we only need a virtual machine. So the virtual machine is, we have in the cloud a virtual machine, and my development machine, computer have a virtual machine, and the test environment have a virtual machine. You only say run, and that's it. And it uses the same Tomcat everywhere. If it's in the cloud or wherever it runs, it's the same Tomcat. So it makes it easy, but it also has a lot of advantages. Yes?
Thank you for giving me the chance. So where do we put this to run in the Tomcat in port 8080 in the Nardemo app? I did not see where we put it. Did we put it in the resource or where?
No, it's just this, only this dependency here. The web dependency. Spring does the rest. Spring Boot does the rest.
Okay.
Now,
So by putting this dependency, it will put it in this Tomcat 8080 by itself?
Yeah.
By default?
Yeah.
Okay, I got it. Okay, thank you. Bye.
So I was looking actually for that constructor. It says 8080 is already in use. I have something else running at 8080. That's why. Let me check. This one is running here. So even though it starts up Tomcat and does all the things, there's nothing to do because I haven't done anything yet. So what I'm going to do, it's still building, so I just wait till it's done. What I'm going to do is I make a cat mapping, basically meaning whenever you get a cat request in on the URL hello, then do the following: public string say hello, and return hello SVR class. Here we get the in constructor here. So here you see it instantiated my demo controller, here the in constructor. So let's get rid of that because I believe it works fine. Okay, so now what I do, I have a controller. I say, whenever you call it with localhost 8080/hello, return hello SWA class. And I run my application again. And then I should be able to call it from within the browser. So if you're in the address bar of the browser, you always send a get. So localhost 8080/hello. Let's see, it's still busy. I don't know why it's so slow. For some reason it starts up very slow. Here it is. So Spring Initializer created for me one class. I created one class with 4 lines of code, 5 lines of code, and I have already a web application that I can call through REST. That's all I need to do. Spring Boot does all the other stuff, the Tomcat, everything. So I can copy paste this, and I can, for example, say goodbye, and then say goodbye, and then make this goodbye. What I also can do, let's create a class here. Let's call it greeting. The greeting class has a method or has an attribute. So private string message, and let's give it getters and setters, and a constructor where I can give the message. Okay, then I go to my controller and I do another get mapping where I say show message, and I return new greeting. Hi there. So it doesn't return a string now, it returns a greeting. And this should be show message or save message. So now I have 3 methods here. Goodbye, show message, hello. Let's run it again. So if I run it again, it has to stop the old Tomcat and then start up a new Tomcat with this new application. Okay, it's almost there. So let's check the hello. So hello works. Let's check the goodbye. Goodbye works. And the other one was show message. Hey, if I return a string, I get to see that string, but if I return an object, it makes it automatically JSON for me. So it serializes it to JSON automatically. Okay, so let's get rid of these ones here. I believe that. Let's do this one simple one. Now, in the controller that's in the web layer, I return the greeting hi there. What if that greeting comes from somewhere else, from the service class? So let's create a new class, service. I call it the greeting service. And okay, it's a typo, but it doesn't matter. I annotate this with add service. And it has a method, so I have to import the annotation here. It has a method, public greeting get greeting. And what does it do? It returns this greeting. So let's change this to greeting. Now, here, I want to call that service method. So I want here return the greeting service dot get greeting. This is what I want. But where does the greeting service come from? Normally in Java you would create it. But in Spring, I don't do that. This is a Spring Bean. So what I do is I say I have a greeting service. This is the name of the attribute. But I have to auto-wire it. So the question, what does auto-wire do? Well, if Spring is in a demo controller and calls this say message, it will instantiate the demo controller, it will instantiate the greeting service, and with add auto wires, it will connect it together. So let me run it first, and you will see. So let's run this again. And the outcome will be exactly the same. Say the same greeting, but now it comes from the greeting service. So what it will do if I start up, it does the following. It first instantiates the demo controller. Then it instantiates the greeting service. Then it sees the add auto wires in the demo controller. It is add auto wires. So the demo controller has an attribute called greeting service. Spring takes care that this greeting service is not null, NULL, it's not a null. We don't get a null pointer now. It points to the greeting service. This is what the add auto wire does. It sets the connection, it sets the reference, it sets the pointer, however you want to call it. So now if I run it, so it runs now, so I can call it now. Yeah, get the same message. Now, what if that greeting comes from the database? That's typically a repository. So let's add a new class. New, and I call it the greeting repository. I annotate it with that repository, meaning Spring will instantiate it. And it has a method loads the greeting from the database. And I'm not going to the real database, I just simulate. So I have a public greeting load. What does it do? It returns this greeting. But now, hello there from Paul. So now my service has to talk to the repository. So what do? At auto wires, I auto wire the repository. So this was the greeting repository. Auto wire now. And get greeting just returns. So here, return greeting repository.load. Get it from the database. That's it. So now let's run it again. What will it do now? What it will do, it instantiates the demo controller, it instantiates the greeting service, it instantiates the greeting repository. It auto wires the greeting service to the greeting repository. And then this runs in Tomcat. I come in with my REST call in the browser. I come in with the methods, same message. That's what I call on the demo controller. It will call get greeting from the greeting service. It will call load from the greeting repository. and that's the greeting what is returned then. So here I call the repository, the controller. Controller calls the service. Service calls the repository. It returns the greeting, and that's what I get to see on my page here. So a hello there from control. Question, does it have to be a service annotated class in order to be auto-wired in a controller class? Doesn't need to be for Spring. Spring doesn't care, but going back to this, the controller only talks to server classes. So according to good design, yes. For Spring, it doesn't care if I call it @service or whatever. So the controllers we annotate with @rest controller. Services we annotate with @service. Repositories we annotate with @repository. And all the other things we annotate with @component. That are the 4 annotations that you use. REST controller, service, @component, @repository. It's all given in the demo application. Can you please explain the difference between web container and web servers? It's the same. A web server contains a web container. It's the same. It's a little, web server might have more than just a container, but you can look at it as the same. What if we are using the service class in other controllers? Does other refer the same memory address, or Spring Boot creates another instance? Now the default is Spring creates only one instance. So if you have another controller, here is there's another controller, and you auto-wire the same service, it points to the same service. And we call it a singleton, there's only one instance of it. Is it possible to use Gradle with Spring? What's the difference compared with Maven? Also, what's the artifact? Yeah, you can do that, but you have to look up the artifact. If you go in Spring Initializer, you can also choose Gradle there if you want. But I give only the Maven dependencies, but you have to look up the Gradle dependency if you want to use that. Otherwise, I would say use Maven. If you have a question, beside being descriptive, what is the difference between using @service and @repository if both are making the class a bean? For Spring, it doesn't matter. And there are small differences we are not going to look into. But I could annotate the @service with @repository and it will work also. I could annotate, well, the REST controller, you need REST controller. You cannot use anything else. But a service, you can use @component and it will work. The repository depends how you make it, but you can use @component there and it will work. I can use @service in the email sender and it will work. So for Spring, it doesn't matter. There are small things, but we don't go in these details. What's the difference between REST controller and REST @controller? Well, there is no @REST, but there is an @controller. REST controller is you return classes. These classes will automatically be serialized to JSON. If you have a controller, you return HTML pages. And that's different. And they are not automatically converted to JSON. So for REST, we always use REST controller. So again, we are not going into all the details of what you can do with Spring Boot because that's all in enterprise architecture. There's a whole course, 4 weeks on Spring Boot. For this course, it's about architectural choices. So I can talk about REST, I can talk about messaging, I can talk about database access, but it really becomes concrete when you really do it yourself. That's why we make Spring Boot applications, and we need this later. When we write microservices, we have to implement them with Spring Boot. And with Spring Cloud, we can connect them together. So we only use a very small portion of Spring Boot. Okay? Now, all the examples that I show, let's see, where are we? This one here. All the examples that I show are given as code, as a zip file, which you can just open in Eclipse or in IntelliJ. And the example that I gave us in the greeting service, I made it a little bit more interesting. It's a contact application. What's a contact? Well, first name, last name, email, phone. I have all kinds of contacts that I need to keep track of, a contact booklet or whatever. So I have a contact controller. That's my REST controller. Here, contact controller. I have a contact service. I have a contact, that's my domain class, just a contact. It's a very simple domain class here. I have an email sender. At any time I add a contact, I send an email. And I have a contact repository that mimics if I go to the database. And this is how it looks. So I put the different classes in the correct package, which represents the layers. So the contact repository goes in the data layer or the data access layer. The contact itself goes in the domain layer. The email sender goes in the integration layer. The contact service in the service layer. The contact controller in the web layer. And then here's my Spring Boot application with the main that I can run. So this is what I get now. This is the different layers and the objects, and they call each other. They are connected with dependency injection, except the contact itself. The domain class is not a Spring class, so you cannot auto-wire it. You can only auto-wire Spring Beans, something that you have annotated with at REST controller, at service, at repository, at components. So here's my repository, very simple. So instead of really going to the database, we look at that later, I just have an in-memory map here of contacts. And I use the first name, that's my key. Let's say that's unique in my contact. So if I say save a contact, I just add it to the list. Find by first name, I find the contact with that key. And delete, I remove it from the list. And find all returns a collection of all the contacts. That's my repository, annotated with that repository. I also have an email sender, annotated with add component, and it has a method send email with a message and an email address, and it just does a system out print line. Just mimicking if I send an email. Then I have a service. So I auto-wire the repository and I auto-wire my email sender. What do I do if I say add a contact? Well, I say repository.save and email sender send an email. Update a contact. Well, repository.save. It's the same in a map. It's the save. Find by first name. Well, call repository find by first name. And delete, I first find it, then I send an email, and then I delete it from the repository. And find all, I say repository find all. It's my service. And then my REST controller, I auto-wire the contact service. And then I make my mappings here. So in Spring Boot, if you want to call a method that you call by sending a cat REST request, you have a cat mapping. If you want to call a method when you send a post, you have a post mapping. If you want to do something when you send a delete, you have a delete mapping, and we also have a put mapping. And then here there's a second cat mapping that is basically give me all the contacts. The first one is give me a contact with a certain name. They just give me all the contacts. Now, what do I do here? REST controller should always return a response entity. That's a class that's already in Spring. That is a class that represents the return, the response that you send back in your HTTP response. And what I do here, I say, give me the contacts with a certain first name. So here, with these brackets, I specify that first name is a variable. Frank, John, Bob, Mary. It's a string. So when I call localhost colon 8080/contacts/Bob, then this first name gets the value Bob. Basically, you say, give me the contact of Bob, contact information of Bob. Then I say, okay, find the contact with first name Bob. Now, if it returns null, meaning we don't have a Bob in the list, then I return a response entity with in the body, there is a custom error type. But this custom error type, that's a class that I wrote myself. That's, oh, it's not shown here. That's a class that I wrote myself. It just has a message. I say the message contact with first name Bob is not available. And I say HTTP state is not found. That's what I return to the client. But if context is not null, I say return the response entity with that context. HTTP state is okay. This is what's sent back. Then post mapping. So I want to add a new contact. So what I do is the URL is /contacts, but you see a request body. I send the contact in the request, in the body of the request. And then the logic is basically add that contact to the list and return that same contact in the response entity. And in the same way, I make a put mapping. It works exactly the same here. Only with put mapping, the best practice for put is that you give here also the first name as a sort of key, the first name, and you put the contact in the body. Well, delete mapping is basically delete the contact with this key. So what do? I first find the contact with that key. If it is not available, then I say with a response entity here, contact with that first name is not available. HTTP state is not found. If I do find it, I delete it. And I return an empty response. I say HTTP state is no content. I don't return anything. Now, if I say get all contacts, what I do, I create a new class context is this class here, context, which contains a list of contexts with getters and setters. That's what I return. Why? Because if I don't do that, I return an array of contexts. But if I put that list I wrap it in a class, I call that class context, I get back a JSON object which contains an array of objects. So that on the client side, I can pass that, or I can translate that to a context class. If I don't do that, I have the following problem. So let me show how that context class looks like. And this is how the contexts look like. It just has a list, collection of contact objects. That's all. If I don't do that, then here's my client, here's the server, and I say, give me all the contacts, and I just return the list of contacts. Then what I get back in JSON is an array of contacts. So then on the client side, I have to go through that array and make objects again. So I'm not going to return an array. No, I return this context column with an array. This is what I return, an object, JSON object. So that on the client side, it makes a context class again, and I can call it directly. I don't have to do anything with arrays or anything. So now I can run this. So let's run this. I have to make sure the other one is not running. The demo app is still running. Now, how can I call it? How can I call the different methods in the controller? Well, the cat mapping, that's easy. I can call it in a browser. But with post, you can, in a browser on a URL, you cannot send a post. So you needed something to send get, put, post, and delete messages. And a tool that's very good in this is Postman. So Postman, you can download it, it's for free. In Postman, you can send messages, you get HTTP requests to a URL. So I can say here, okay, what request do I want to send? Okay, let's do a cat request. The cat request on /contacts and give me the contact with the name Frank. It will probably come back that it doesn't exist because if I started my application, there is no contact. So still running, still starting up. Okay, getting there. So if I now say send here, so it sends that request. I get a contact /Frank. The contact with first name Frank is not available. That's correct. So the first thing I have to do is add a contact. How do I do that? With a post. And what's the URL? Contacts. But I have to send a contact in the body. So go here to the body and I did this already, so I don't have to type it all in. So say first name Mary Johnson. So in JSON, this is what I'm going to send to the server. What will happen? Well, this method is called. It's a post mapping. It gets the contact here in the request body and it adds it to the list. Let's do that. So I just say send here. It will add it on the server side. And I get back that same contact that I just added. So let's add another one. Let's do, this is John. So we have John and Mary. So let's make this J, and telephone number is a little bit different. Send. Okay. So now what I can do cat, give me all the contacts. Cat/contacts. Now it should give me back, you will see. I get a JSON object which contains an array with all the contacts, John and Mary. I can also say, well, give me now John. I only want John. And I get back John. I can also, well, let's delete John. Let's do a delete. And the key is John, so send. It will come back with an empty body, but it says here 204, no content, so everything works fine. I don't send content back. So let's see, let's do a catch with John. It's really deleted. So yeah, John, we don't have a John. Okay, what do we still have then? So Mary should be still there. Let's check. And there's Mary. So the code that I've written is very simple and very short. So let's look in IntelliJ here. So I have my controller, just a few methods for update, delete, etc. I auto-wire the contact service in the service layer. And it has the methods add and find, etc. I auto-wire an email sender and a contact repository. I will show the DMS sender later. My email sender is just a component with system.out.println. My repository is just a class with a list. And the contact is plain Java. We call it a POJO, a plain old Java object. Okay, let's see. Could you upload this demo? Yeah, so if you go to the course site, everything is there. Not that one. So for every lecture, when there is demo code, I post it in the course site. So you go to week 1, lecture 2, you see the demo code, there's a zip file, and everything is in there. So could you explain why we need response entity instead of simple contact object? So here you see the zip file, which contains a number of projects. It will also work with a contact object only with response entity. It's a best practice because you have more control about what you send back. So, for example, it's much easier to set the HTTP status. It's much easier to add headers to the request. So you should the best practice is always return a response entity. Is the custom arrow type a built-in class? No, that's the one I created myself here. Custom arrow type is just a class with a string, with the arrow message. That's all. Could you explain what the context class does again? Yeah, so in my context controller, when I say, give me all the contexts, I go to the context service and say, find all. Context service goes to the repository and says, give me all the contexts. What does it return? A collection of contexts. Let's say 3 contexts. If I return that collection, then I get back this contact 1, contact 2, contact 3, an array. And it will work if I do use Postman, I just see that array, no problem. But if the client side is Java, Postman is a Java application, then when I get in an array of JSON objects, and then I have to convert that JSON array to my own array. Or so in Java, what do I do? Do I make a map out of it? Do I make a list or a set? And how do I do that? I have to do it all myself. I don't want to do it myself. That's why it's much easier, always return an object. Don't return a list, return an object. So what do? I make an object called contacts, which contains the list. Meaning, now I get back this context here. I get back a JSON object. I don't get back an array, a JSON object. So if I have then that context object also on the client side, Spring Boot will take care that that JSON object that I get back, it will automatically be a context class or object. So again, I don't have to use it, but I use it so that the client is simpler. That's all. Okay, go back to these slides here. So I explained already that Spring Boot automatically puts Tomcat in my jar file. So I don't have to start up Tomcat or whatever. I don't have to deploy anything. It works automatically. So this is what we have so far. Now, I want to, this is what I just demoed. I want to add a contact. So here I add a contact, and here get one contact, get all contacts, delete a contact. So we've seen this. What Spring Boot also does, this might be handy for later, it automatically reads the file application.properties. It creates that file for me and it reads that. So in there I can write all kinds of properties. In there I can change the default port for Tomcat. Instead of 8080 I want 8081. So I think it's called server.port is, you say 8090 and then it runs on 8090. Now here, I just put my own property there. SMTP server is smtp.mydomain.com, sort of configuration. What I can do in Spring, we're not going to use this, but what I can do with add value, I can set a property of a Spring class with the value that is specified in the properties file. So what will it do when it creates email service info, when it instantiates, it says, hey, there's an add value, and it's SMTP server. Let's go to application.properties, read the value of SMTP server, and set the value of this attribute to whatever the value of SMTP server is. So that's sometimes handy. Also, you see when we start up Spring Boot, it has this logging information. You get this banner of Spring, and then it's all kind of logging information, and then you get to see your information. You can turn it off if you put these 2 lines in application.properties. So now what we're going to do is we're going to write a Java application, a Spring Boot application, that is a REST client, a standalone Spring Boot application that calls my controller. We have already the controller. And now I want a REST client. This is a standalone Spring Boot application. And Spring Boot has a REST template. That's already in Spring Boot. And it has 4 methods. One for get, one for post, one for delete, one for put. Get, put, post, delete. And what does these methods do? Send an HTTP get message, send an HTTP post message, etc. So all I need to do, okay, this is my REST client. There's actually only one class here. Maybe I should show the complete code. That's easier than going back and forward on these slides. So also this code is given a REST client. This is my Spring Boot application class again, which has a main. Main is always the same, Spring application.run. But I do something else. What I do is I define a bean with add bean. This is the way that you create a REST template in Spring Boot. That's all you need to do, a REST template. So this is what I need for Spring Boot, otherwise it doesn't work. So it creates a bean REST template. It instantiates this bean with the name REST template. I want to call methods on this REST template. So what am I going to do? I inject that REST template with add autowired in this class. This is dependency injection. And then my class implements command line runner interface. That's an interface that has one method run. So I need to implement the run method. And what it will do, it says here, REST template post for location, basically send a post request to localhost 8080 contacts and put this contact, Frank Brown, in the body. So it will send a post request to the server. Then I do it again, but then John Doe. So now, after these 2 lines, 2 contacts are in my server. Then I say, get for objects, send a get with that server URL, and the first name here, I fill in Frank. And whatever you get back, make it a contact. The JSON that you get back, make it a contact class. So get back here a contact class. Basically, give me the contact with the first name Frank. And I print it here. Then, REST template get for object server URL, that's /contacts, that basically means give me all the contacts. And this is the question, why do we have a contacts class? This is the reason. Whatever that method returns, translate it in a context class. And then I say, just print that context class. Otherwise, I need to, by hand, I get back a JSON array, and by hand I have to translate that in some kind of list. I don't want to do that. That's why I have this context class. Here I send a delete, so delete the contact John, then update Frank, change the email of Frank and do a put, so to update it. And then again I do get all contacts and print it out. So if I run this application, it will call my REST application. So while it's building, why do I need a run method here? Why can't I just put that in the main method? Well, that's how Spring works. So you see the output here. Oh no, the output is coming. Why do I need a run method? What Spring does, so remember, this is not a web application. This doesn't run in Tomcat. This is a standalone application, standalone Java application. So here you see the get John and get the context, etc. But how Spring works is the following. How Spring Boot works. What's the time?
Professor?
Yes?
What is the basic need of REST client? Can you explain it a little bit more?
I didn't understand that. Can you repeat it?
The need of REST client. I don't understand it. Can you explain it more? Again?
You don't know what a REST client is. That's a client or a REST server. So the application that we've shown before with the controller, that's a server application that runs in Tomcat. So here's Tomcat, and in Tomcat here's my controller, and it talks to all the other classes. Tomcat runs on port 8080. How can I call it? Well, we did Postman, but I want applications to be able to call this server. A Java application, that's a REST client. So Postman is a REST client, but I want a Java REST client, or a .NET REST client, or a Python REST client, or whatever, or Angular. My Angular application is a REST client because it calls on this application on a REST interface. That's a REST client. An application that can send REST messages. So now I have this standalone Java application that's going to send over REST. It's going to call my REST controller. Now, how does Spring Boot work without looking at all the details? Why do I need a run method? If I say Spring application of run, the first thing that Spring does, it creates a context. What's the context? Just a Spring class. That's it. So I'm in my REST client application. And let's see, how do I write this? So there's a static main method. So this is my REST client application. Here's my main method. Here, static. It's the main. The virtual machine calls the main method. In the main method, I call Spring application.run. Spring will instantiate all classes it needs to instantiate. In this case, the only class it will instantiate is a REST template here, REST template. So it creates a REST template. It creates, and as you don't see it, but it's underwater, it creates a context. What's a context? Just a Spring class that knows the reference to the REST template.
Professor?
Yeah?
We cannot see what you're writing.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So here's my REST template here, and it creates a context, and the context is something that Spring uses internally, but it has a reference to my REST template. This is what happens. This is what Spring first does. If I call Spring application.run. The next thing that it does is it looks, do I need to inject, do I need to do a dependency injection? Yes. You need to do a dependency injection. So what it does, there is an attribute called a REST template here. And it needs to point to my REST template. So Spring will do the dependency injection. It will do this. So REST template now points to the REST template. That's what Spring application.run does as the second one. First, instantiate the objects. Second, do the dependency injection. And then as last, if there is a run method, call the run method. That's where you want to do your logic in a standalone application. If I have a REST web application, I don't need to have a run method because it's a controller that I can call over the web through REST with Postman or whatever. But now I have a standalone Java application. If I don't have that run method, it will start up everything, wire everything together, and then my application is done. So that's why now the third thing that it will do, call the run method. What is run method? Well, REST template do this, REST template do this, REST template send a post, REST template send a get. So that's what I have now. I have a standalone Java application that calls my server application that you can call through REST. And it has all the layers, etc. Now there's one more thing I'm going to add and then we're done. So this is what we have so far. What I'm going to do now is I want to send a message to JMS. Well, let's I forgot about the questions here. Could you show again how to set properties in application of properties, especially? No, I'm not going, well, I showed it through messaging. Professor, what is REST template being used for? Are we posting to a different server? Now, you need to send this application on the left, needs to send get, put, post, and delete HTTP requests. Where's my, I'm looking for my mouse here. So this application here, the client, we're in Java, we have to send HTTP get, put, post, and delete request with the body and with everything that we need. And then we receive a response and we have to unpack the response and get a JSON out and make objects out of it. Why should we write it all ourselves if Spring can do that for us? That's the REST template. It's a convenience class with 4 methods that does everything REST related for us. We just say post for location and it sends a post request with the body, etc. We send get for object and it sends a get request. That's why we need it. Otherwise we have to write it all ourselves. What do we really mean when we say standalone application? An application that does not run in an application server or a web server. Plain Java. Your first Hello World Java application with a main where you say system out print line Hello World. That's a standalone application that you start and stops automatically. That's a standalone application on itself that you can run anywhere, you can deploy it anywhere. That's what I mean with a standalone application. That's that lesson 2 Spring Boot REST client demo. You can start it as many times as you want. So now what I'm going to add is messaging. We saw GMS. I'm going to send a message. And as middleware, I'm going to use ActiveMQ. I could have used a RabbitMQ or whatever, but Spring has support for, built-in support for RabbitMQ and ActiveMQ. I choose one, ActiveMQ. And we've seen already here point-to-point and publish subscribe. I'm going to use point-to-point. So if I do that, then I need to add this dependency in both the sender and the receiver application. So who's the sender? That's my application that runs in Tomcat, my contacts application. And then I make a standalone receiver that gets messages whenever a contact is added. So I need this dependency for GMS and ActiveMQ. And what I'm going to, in this example, this is just example code, I'm going to send a person from the sender to the receiver. How am I going to do that in Spring Boot? The sender, we have to send messages in Java. Guess what Spring Boot does? GMS template. It's a class that can send GMS messages. There's just one method. Convert and send. That's all it does. So here, this is a sender application. It's plain sender application with a main here. It has a Spring Boot annotation. It also has an add enable GMS. So here we say to Spring, hey, we're going to use GMS. And I auto-wire a GMS template. I don't have to do anything else. Spring creates for me a GMS template. In a run method, what I do, I create a person Frank Brown. I translate it to a JSON string. And then I say GMS template, convert and send this JSON string to the queue with this name, test queue in ActiveMQ. So it will send the serialized or the JSON string Frank Brown to the queue in ActiveMQ with the name test queue. How does it know where to send it to? Application.properties. So the question, application.properties. Here, this is the configuration that I put in application. Where does this come from? From application.properties. ActiveMQ runs on this localhost this port, and the default to do something on it is user ID admin, password admin. Spring will read application of properties. So again, Spring does everything for me. The moment Spring sees enable GMS, what it will do, it reads application of properties. It knows how to call ActiveMQ. It creates a GMS template. And when I say convert and send, it will send it to ActiveMQ. This is my sender. Now, a receiver. My receiver. The configuration is exactly the same. How do I get to ActiveMQ? Exactly the same. But on the receiver side, I have a listener. So I have also enabled GMS here on my application. But I create a component, a class, a Spring Bean, with a method. How the method is called doesn't matter. I call it receive message. I don't know where it comes from. And it gets in a string, it's a JSON string. And basically I say here, I have a GMS listener. Whenever something comes in at the queue test queue, call this method. And the content of that message, that string, I pass to this method. That's all I need to do. And what I do then now, I get that JSON string, I convert it back to a person, and I print out, I received the message with this first name and last name. And if there is an error, that I cannot convert this to a person object. This is my whole receiver application. That's all. So now I go to my contact application. What I'm going to do, I have already here, I have two applications. I have this application is my client. I have this application that's my server, runs in Tomcat. I'm going to write a new application. So all it does is a GMS listener. Whenever there is a message that comes in at this message box, do a system out print line. And then, whenever you add a new contact, send an EMS message here. I have here a EMS sender here that sends a EMS message to ActiveMQ, and then my other application will be called, hey, there's a new contact. This is the first name, this is the last name, etc. So what I have now, the end result is 3 different applications. 1 that runs in Tomcat and 2 standalone Java applications. And you have the code, but let's see here. So here is my receiver. You see I run it already a few times. So this is my receiver with the listener here. And this is my client. And then I also have my, this one, the Spring Boot, the contacts. This one is already running. It sends already GMS messages. I have it already in here. Send a GMS message. And what I can do now, so if I run the client, let's run the client, because I did it already a few times. So then it calls the server in Tomcat. The server in Tomcat sends a EMS message, and my receiver can now get that message. Let's see, I don't think I run the receiver. Let's run the receiver here. So what we get now is here's my receiver, my EMS receiver application. And this one sends a message to a mailbox. This one listens to that mailbox, and this one will then write a system out print line. And the lines of code I have to write for it, that's why we use Spring Boot. It's just a little bit, I have templates, I have listeners, I hardly have to do anything. If you had to write this all 3 applications in plain Java, that would take you a couple of days, probably, to make that all work. Depends how experienced you are. But that's a lot of code you have to write. So you see here all these messages that come in. And what I can also do with ActiveMQ, it has its own dashboard here. So once it's running, I zoomed in a little bit too much. Okay, this is better. So you can log in and you can look at queues. So right now, if I go to, here's my test queue, you see that I sent and received already 12 messages, and there's 1 consumer now connected. So if I run my client again, it will see, well, this one will go up depending on how much messages I sent. If I stop my consumer, this one will go to 0. This is what we're going to do in the lab. This is what you're going to do this afternoon. So you have an example, only you don't do it with context, but with books. But it's exactly the same. Can the receiver be implemented in other technologies like C#? Yes. And assembler also, to the client application that calls REST. Can be anything that can handle REST or that can handle messages with JSON content. Doesn't need to be Java. Okay, so to summarize, we saw the different layers and the different classes with their corresponding responsibilities. Tomorrow, we will focus on this part here, the domain. What are the patterns we use in a domain? And we will also look at servers layer here. The day after, we will look at the data access class. How do we really go to a database? And we look at different databases. Now,
Professor,
yeah,
this service layer is for tomorrow?
we go in more depth of it. But now you need, in the lab, you're going to implement something that I've shown here with context. But we go more in depth in the service. And what are the characteristics of this service class? Now, yesterday we looked at key architecture principles. And here is our third key architecture principle. whenever something becomes too complex, we divide it into simpler parts. That's what layering does for us. Instead of one big large thing, we put it nicely in layers. And we looked at dependency injection and how it all works in Spring Boot. Also, integration. Typically you use either messaging or REST. It's the best practice. So, connecting the parts of knowledge with the holders of knowledge. Layering is a powerful technique to separate different aspects of a system. The service class is the connection point between the different layers. That's the reception where you enter, and it can talk to all the other layers. Transcendental consciousness is the direct experience of pure consciousness, the unified field of all the laws of nature, and holds moving within itself. In unity consciousness, one appreciates the inherent underlying unity that underlies all the diversity of creation. Okay, any questions? So do we get the lecture video recording now or tomorrow morning? And I will see how long it takes. So I think the first part is done. So I will post, after we are done, I will post at least the recording for the first part. I will have to see how long it takes for the second part. Sometimes it takes 1.5 hours or so just to create an MP4 out of it. Sometimes it's 2 hours. The broker URL, you find it in the assignment. It's in the assignment, in the lab. Okay, any remaining question before we end with the meditation?